The sharp crackle of gravel under sneakers shattered the early morning stillness as a figure emerged from the misty trail, fast, focused, and seemingly unstoppable. But to the watchful eyes of an old man peering through his window, something about the scene felt wrong. The neighborhood was still waking up. The faint hum of sprinklers broke the silence, and the air carried the earthy scent of freshly cut grass. Most houses along the suburban street had curtains drawn, their occupants still wrapped in sleep. But not George Whitman. From his perch by the bay window, coffee cup in hand, his sharp gaze scanned the park across the street like a hawk guarding its territory. George had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, and he prided himself on knowing every face, every routine. This morning, however, a stranger disrupted his sense of order. A tall, athletic man in a gray hoodie, sprinting along the trail with an intensity George hadn't seen before. "Who runs like that at this hour?" George muttered, setting his coffee down. Something about the jogger's pace, relentless, almost superhuman, didn't sit right with him. He squinted, trying to make out more details. Dark skin, muscular build. The jogger was cutting through the park at an impressive speed, his movements fluid and precise. George's unease grew. He had read too many headlines about break-ins and suspicious activity to dismiss the situation. Grabbing his phone, he dialed a number he had used more times than he cared to admit. 911. "What's your emergency?" "This is George Whitman," he began, his voice steady but insistent. "There's a suspicious individual running through Maplewood Park. He doesn't look like he's from around here. You might want to check it out." The operator assured him an officer would be dispatched, but George remained at the window, his fingers drumming against the sill. Meanwhile, the jogger, oblivious to the scrutiny, veered off the trail and headed toward the open field. As minutes passed, George's anxiety shifted into something darker, a mix of indignation and determination. Who did this man think he was, tearing through his neighborhood like that? When a patrol car finally rolled into view, George hurried outside, waving it down. "That's him," he said, pointing toward the field where the jogger had paused, hands on his hips, catching his breath. The officer nodded and stepped out of the car, his radio crackling softly. George followed at a distance, his chest tightening with a mix of anticipation and dread. The jogger, noticing the approaching officer, straightened and removed his hood, revealing a face George should have recognized instantly, but didn't. The tension in the air thickened as the officer approached, his hand resting near his holster. George crossed his arms, convinced he had done the right thing. But the jogger's calm demeanor and piercing gaze hinted at a story far more complicated than George could have imagined. "Sir," the officer called out, his tone cautious but firm. "We need to have a word with you." The jogger didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled faintly, his voice steady as he replied, "Is there a problem, officer?" George's stomach churned as he watched the scene unfold. Something about the jogger's quiet confidence unnerved him. Who was this man? And why did he seem so unfazed by the confrontation? As the officer began asking questions, the jogger's responses were concise, his tone unwavering. George felt a pang of doubt creeping in, but it was quickly buried by his conviction that he had done the right thing. He hadn't spent decades in this neighborhood to let strangers disrupt its peace. And yet, as the conversation continued, subtle shifts in the officer's expression told a different story, one that George wasn't prepared for. The jogger reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out an ID card. Handing it to the officer, he said something that made George's ears burn. "You might recognize the name," the jogger added, his voice calm but carrying a hint of something sharper. Pride, perhaps, or defiance. The officer's eyebrows shot up as he glanced at the card, then back at the jogger. George's heart raced, his mind scrambling to piece together the puzzle before him. Who was this man? And why did his presence command such quiet authority? The answers were coming, but they would leave George reeling in a way he never anticipated. The officer's hand trembled slightly as he studied the ID card. George could barely make out the name printed on it, but the officer's reaction said more than words ever could. There was no doubt now, this jogger wasn't just anyone. George's mind raced, trying to piece together the significance of the name, but before he could make sense of it, The officer handed the card back with a sharp nod. "I'm going to need you to stick around for a moment," the officer said, his voice a little too tight, as if he were trying to hide the surprise in his voice. George's stomach twisted with confusion. What had just happened? Why did the officer seem so thrown off? And why had the jogger, so calm in the face of this entire situation, said those words? What did he mean? "You might recognize the name." The jogger didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just stood there, his posture unyielding. He looked at George, his eyes unwavering. George had the sudden sensation that this man wasn't just a jogger passing through. He was someone with a history, a presence that reached far beyond the suburban streets they were on. "Can you explain what this is all about?" George asked, his voice edged with frustration. The jogger's steady gaze only made his unease grow. The jogger smiled faintly but didn't respond, turning back to the officer, who now appeared to be waiting for something. It was as though a silent conversation was happening between them, one that George wasn't privy to, and that only made his anxiety worse. He shifted from foot to foot, trying to make sense of everything. It was at that moment that the jogger spoke again, his voice softer, but still carrying an undeniable authority. "You've called the police on me for a reason. You think I'm a threat, don't you?" George froze. The jogger's words felt like a challenge, an accusation. How could he know what George was thinking? George had no idea who this man was, yet somehow, the jogger seemed to see right through him, to the very core of his discomfort and suspicion. "I never said anything about a threat," George muttered, trying to maintain some control over the situation. He wasn't sure why, but his skin felt too tight, his mouth dry as dust. The officer, who had remained silent for a few moments, finally spoke up. "We're going to need to verify some things," he said, glancing at George briefly. There was something different in the officer's eyes now, something closer to understanding, or perhaps something else entirely. George wasn't sure if he liked it. The jogger nodded, almost as if he expected this moment to arrive. "Of course," he said, and his calmness only made George feel more exposed, more vulnerable. How was it that a simple jogger could carry himself with so much composure in a situation like this? Then, just as George began to feel the tension reach its breaking point, the jogger's phone rang. It was a deep, melodic tone that sounded almost too serene for such a moment. The jogger didn't flinch or hesitate. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and glanced at the screen. His eyes narrowed, and without a word, he answered. "Hello?" he said, his voice smooth, controlled. George strained to hear, but the jogger's conversation was too quiet, the words too faint. He could only catch snippets, something about a press conference, a sudden change in plans, a name George didn't recognize. The officer stood back, his gaze flicking nervously between George and the jogger, but George didn't notice. His attention was riveted on the jogger's side of the conversation. And then, like a sudden burst of recognition, it hit George. He knew that name. The jogger's name, the one printed on the ID card. He had seen it in the newspapers, on television. The Olympian. It didn't make sense. Why was this famous athlete here, in his neighborhood, running as though he didn't have a care in the world? The pieces clicked together in a way that shocked him. But even with the realization, it didn't explain why the jogger had reacted the way he did. There was still so much George didn't understand. He was on the verge of saying something when the jogger's conversation ended abruptly. The jogger pocketed his phone and turned toward George, his eyes meeting his once more. "I'm sure you're wondering why I'm here," the jogger said, his voice now a little louder, a little more intense. "And I'm sure you've got questions. But you'll get the answers in time. Just know this. What you think you know about me, it's not the whole story." George swallowed hard. What was this man getting at? The tension between them had escalated so quickly, so unexpectedly, and now George found himself caught in the crossfire of something far larger than he could have imagined. The officer turned to George, his tone now authoritative. "We'll take it from here, sir. I suggest you stay out of it." But George couldn't. He couldn't just walk away. Not after everything that had happened in the past few minutes. There was something more here, something beneath the surface that he couldn't ignore. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change. George stood frozen, his mind racing as the officer gestured for him to step back. but he couldn't. His feet felt like they were glued to the ground, his eyes glued to the jogger who, despite the rising tension, remained unervingly composed. The officer seemed to sense George's hesitation. He shot him a sharp look. "You heard me. Step back." But George wasn't ready to walk away. There was something gnawing at him, a pull, an undeniable instinct telling him that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This man, this Olympian, no less, had come here for a reason, and it wasn't just for a run. The jogger was still standing there, his back straight, his expression unreadable. He wasn't worried. In fact, George could almost feel the smugness rolling off of him, a calm certainty that everything would play out in his favor. "I think," the jogger said slowly, his gaze now fixed on George, "you should know that it wasn't me you were supposed to worry about." George felt a chill spread through him, as if the air had thickened and turned heavy. "What does that mean?" he asked, the words coming out sharper than he intended. The jogger didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced over at the officer, his eyes momentarily narrowing. The officer shifted uncomfortably, his fingers tapping against the side of his belt, as if he were anticipating something he hadn't fully prepared for. "I mean that you've misunderstood everything," the jogger said quietly, the subtle edge in his voice making George's unease grow. The officer took a small step forward, his voice lowering as he addressed the jogger, but it was clear that his usual authority wasn't as solid as it had been before. "You're not making sense. We've done our job. Now you're going to come with us, and we'll sort this out." But the jogger didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out his phone again, as though he were checking something, some kind of message or notification. George couldn't see the screen, but he knew it was important. The jogger's posture shifted, ever so slightly, like a chess player about to make his next move. "You should really make a call," the jogger said, glancing up at the officer. The words were calm, but there was a weight behind them that made the air feel even thicker. The officer's brow furrowed, but before he could respond, the jogger's phone rang again. This time, George could hear the conversation clearly. The words were directed at the officer, and they were far more serious than anything George had anticipated. "It's about your investigation," the jogger said into the phone. "You might want to check who called. The person you're looking for is closer than you think." The officer's face drained of color, and his eyes flicked nervously toward George. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice suddenly uncertain. But the jogger didn't answer directly. Instead, he lowered the phone and gave George a look that made his stomach tighten. "You're in deeper than you realize," he said, his tone quiet but heavy with meaning. "What you thought was just a jogger running through your neighborhood is so much more than that. What's happening now? It's just the beginning." The officer took another step forward, his hand resting on his radio as if trying to compose himself. "You need to come with us now. This isn't a game." The jogger didn't even flinch. He was completely calm, utterly composed. "I'm afraid it's already too late for that," he said, his voice almost too soft for the moment. George's pulse quickened, his thoughts spiraling out of control. The entire situation had shifted. No longer was it a simple call to the police about a man jogging through the neighborhood. This was something else, something far more dangerous, and George could feel it in every fiber of his being. Something was lurking just beneath the surface, and he had a feeling that no one was prepared for what was about to happen next. The officer took a deep breath, his grip on his radio tightening. "If you know something, now's the time to tell us." But the jogger shook his head slowly. "There are bigger forces at play. You think you're in control? You're not." George's heart hammered in his chest. What had this man just said? What had he just revealed? And why was the officer acting like he knew something more? Like the jogger's words weren't just ramblings, but a warning. "Listen to me," the jogger continued, locking eyes with George, his gaze intense. "You're about to find out everything you thought you knew about this place, about your neighborhood, about your world, was wrong." The officer's eyes darted nervously between the jogger and George, as if trying to gauge what to do next. George could feel the tension in the air like a live wire, crackling with potential danger. Every second that passed seemed to carry the weight of something terrible, something inevitable, but he couldn't quite place it. George opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a single word out, there was a sharp crack. a sound so sudden, so violent, that it made him jump. The officer's hand moved swiftly to his sidearm, but the jogger was already ahead of him, his movements swift and decisive. The tension in the air exploded as everything around them shifted, and George realized nothing would ever be the same again. The crack was followed by another, this time louder and more forceful. George's eyes widened in shock as the sound echoed through the street, his heartbeat thudding in his chest. The officer's hand was still hovering over his weapon, but there was a hesitation now, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The jogger, however, remained unervingly calm, his eyes never leaving George's. "What's happening?" George managed to ask, his voice shaky, though he couldn't tell if it was from fear or the overwhelming sense that something was terribly wrong. The jogger didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze shifted, briefly scanning the street behind them, as if expecting something or someone. The tension was thick, like a storm waiting to break, and George felt a chill creep down his spine. Every moment seemed to stretch out unnaturally long, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger, something much darker. The officer's radio crackled to life, breaking the silence. The voice on the other end was muffled, but George could make out a few words. Asterisk, we've got a situation. Need backup. Now. Asterisk. The jogger's expression remained unchanged, but George could see the slightest twitch in his jaw, a sign that whatever was happening, the jogger had anticipated it. The officer quickly turned his back, speaking urgently into his radio, his voice low and quick. "I need more units. Now, get to the south end of the block. Keep it quiet," the officer said, his voice tense with authority. George's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information. The jogger had said something about forces at play, about control, about a bigger picture. But what did that mean? And why was the officer reacting like this? Like the situation had spiraled beyond anything he had prepared for. The jogger slowly turned his head to face George again, his eyes locking onto him with an unsettling intensity. "You're not safe here," he said, his voice low, but carrying an undeniable weight. "Not anymore." George took an instinctive step back, suddenly aware of the danger surrounding him. The air felt charged, heavy with impending chaos. His thoughts spun, but he couldn't seem to make sense of it all. Why was this happening? Who was this man, really? And what had he just uncovered? The officer, still speaking into his radio, took a cautious step toward the jogger, his eyes narrowed. "You're under suspicion. I don't know who you think you are, but you've caused enough trouble today." The jogger's lips curled slightly, a small but knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Trouble? No. I'm here to stop the real trouble from finding its way to you." The officer didn't respond, but the tension between them was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. George felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting for something catastrophic to happen. Suddenly, from the corner of his eye, George saw movement. A black SUV creeping down the street, its tinted windows giving it an ominous, almost predatory look. The vehicle slowed as it neared them, its engine rumbling like a distant storm. The officer's gaze flicked toward the SUV, his hand tightening around the radio in a silent, almost instinctual gesture. "Who the hell are they?" he muttered under his breath, his voice filled with suspicion. The jogger didn't even flinch, his eyes still locked on George. "I told you, you're not safe here. Not anymore. And neither is anyone else." The SUV came to a slow stop just a few feet away from them. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and imposing, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. He wore a black suit, and despite the heat of the day, he carried himself with an almost cold, calculated air. The officer took a step back, his hand finally dropping from his sidearm, as if sensing that this new arrival posed a much greater threat than he had expected. The man in the suit didn't look at the officer, instead focusing entirely on the jogger. His lips twitched slightly, a brief flicker of recognition, or perhaps something darker, passing over his features. "You should have stayed out of this," the man in the suit said, his voice cool and deliberate, though there was an underlying tension that made George's blood run cold. The jogger took a slow step forward, his posture unwavering. "I didn't have a choice," he replied evenly. "This has been in motion far longer than you think." The officer looked between the two men, his confusion growing. "What is this? Who are you people?" The man in the suit ignored him completely, his gaze never leaving the jogger. "You've disrupted things already," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "The plan is already in motion. There's nothing you can do now." The jogger's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You've underestimated everyone. But it's not too late to make things right." A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the faint sound of distant sirens. George could feel his heart hammering in his chest. He didn't know what was happening, but he could sense the weight of it. This was bigger than just an old man calling the police on a jogger. This was about something far more dangerous, something with far-reaching consequences. And just like that, the world seemed to shift. The officer, the jogger, the man in the suit. Everything was aligned in a way that George couldn't understand, but he knew one thing for sure. The moment had arrived, and there was no going back. The man in the suit stepped closer to the jogger, the weight of his presence pressing down on the air around them. George watched as they exchanged a silent, almost imperceptible look, something passing between them, a recognition that set off alarm bells in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was far more significant than he could comprehend. The officer's grip tightened on his radio again, though he remained silent, as if waiting for the next move. His gaze flicked back to George, then to the suited man, then to the jogger, clearly unsure of what to do. It was as if all the rules had suddenly changed, and he was caught in the middle of a situation he didn't know how to control. George shifted his weight, his instincts telling him to get away, but his feet felt rooted to the ground, held captive by the tension hanging in the air. He wanted answers. He needed to understand what was happening, but with every passing second, the sense of danger only grew. The man in the suit turned toward the officer for the first time, his eyes narrowing as if appraising him. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he said, his voice dangerously calm. The officer blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about? You think you can just waltz in here and—" "You have no idea," the suited man interrupted, his tone growing darker. "This isn't just about a jogger and a phone call. There are bigger forces at play, and you've already crossed a line by getting involved." George felt a wave of unease ripple through him. Forces at play? What did that mean? Who were these people, really? And why had the officer suddenly gone quiet, his hands trembling slightly as if he was no longer in control? The jogger shifted his position slightly, his body tense, his eyes scanning the street as if waiting for something to happen. "It's already too late," he said, his voice steady but carrying a certain urgency. "You should have let me handle this from the start." The man in the suit gave a slight nod, as if the jogger's words had confirmed something. He took another step closer, his shoes clicking sharply against the pavement, each step deliberate and heavy with intent. "Now, we're both in it. The question is, how far are you willing to go to make sure this doesn't get worse?" George's heart skipped a beat. What were they talking about? Who was this jogger, really? What was so important that it had brought all of them to this moment? Suddenly, without warning, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, rapidly approaching from multiple directions. The suited man's expression tightened, his body rigid as he glanced back toward the sound, his hand instinctively moving toward his side, as if readying himself for a confrontation. The officer tensed, looking toward the sirens as well, but his confusion was evident. He was clearly trying to process what was happening, his hand still gripping the radio, but his focus was divided, flickering between the jogger and the growing threat of whatever was coming. "Backup's here," the officer muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The suited man turned his head slowly to the officer, his lips curling into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. "You think that's going to help? You don't understand what's coming." His voice dropped to a low, menacing tone. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than all of us." The jogger didn't flinch. "I'm the only one who can stop it. But not if they get here first." George's mind raced. The sirens were closer now, and he could hear the screeching of tires as cars came to a halt nearby. The tension in the air felt suffocating, like a storm cloud about to unleash. Every muscle in George's body screamed at him to run, to get out of there, but his legs refused to move. The fear, no, the certainty that something catastrophic was about to unfold rooted him to the spot. A black SUV, larger than the first, sped down the street and screeched to a halt just a few feet from where they stood. The windows were tinted, and this time, there were no subtle movements. The doors swung open sharply, and men dressed in dark tactical gear spilled out. They moved with precision, almost robotic, as if they had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. They didn't glance at George or the officer. They were focused entirely on the jogger. "Move," one of them barked to the officer. "This doesn't concern you anymore." The officer stood frozen, his eyes wide, not knowing whether to pull his weapon or step aside. His voice shook as he spoke. "What the hell is going on here?" The suited man looked at the officer, then back to the jogger, his gaze hardening. "It's already over for you," he said quietly. "You've made your choice. Now you live with it." The jogger's eyes flashed with something that sent a chill through George's spine. Was it fear, or something more dangerous? He opened his mouth as if to say something, but just as the words formed, one of the tactical men stepped forward, blocking him from view. "Time's up," the suited man said, and in that moment, the world seemed to stop. The air thickened, as if waiting for something to break. George barely registered the swift movement of the men as they converged on the jogger, their hands quick and efficient, grabbing him by the arms. The jogger didn't resist, but the look in his eyes, defiant, determined, unyielding, sent a surge of adrenaline through George's body. And just like that, with the tension at its breaking point, George understood one thing. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and the clock was ticking down to something far worse than a simple misunderstanding. The men in tactical gear tightened their grip on the jogger, who now stood motionless between them, his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked from George to the suited man, and for a moment, there was something almost pleading in them, like he wanted to say something, but the words were caught in his throat. George's heart pounded in his chest, and his hands trembled as he watched the scene unfold. Everything inside him screamed to do something, anything. He had to act. But what could he possibly do in a situation this tense, this dangerous? The officer stood frozen, a witness to the whole thing, but utterly powerless, his fingers still clutching the radio, unsure whether to call for backup or retreat. His gaze shifted between the suited man and the group of tactical officers, his face pale with confusion. "You should leave," the suited man said, his voice quiet but commanding, his eyes locked on the officer. "This is no longer your business." The officer's jaw clenched, and for a moment, George thought he might refuse. But then the officer's eyes flicked to the approaching vehicles, their lights flashing brighter now. The backup was coming, and with it, more uncertainty. The officer's posture slumped slightly, and with a hesitant step backward, he finally made a move for his squad car, muttering under his breath, "This isn't over." George didn't know what to think. There was a sudden, overwhelming sense that he was in way over his head. This wasn't just a simple case of racial profiling or mistaken identity anymore. Whatever was happening here, whatever this was about, it was much larger than any of them could comprehend. As the officer sped off, the suited man turned his attention back to the jogger, his expression a mixture of anticipation and control. He stepped closer to him, the crowd that had gathered around them standing in stunned silence. No one dared to move or speak, caught in the strange, suffocating tension that gripped the street. "We're running out of time," the suited man said, his voice low and urgent. "This needs to be done now." The jogger's jaw tightened, and a flicker of anger flashed across his face. "I told you. You don't get to decide when this ends. It's my choice." A tactical officer stepped forward, his hand on his holstered gun, though his body language remained cautious. "We don't have time for your defiance. You know what this means." For the first time since the encounter began, the jogger's eyes flicked over to George, locking onto him with an intensity that felt like a silent plea. George could feel his throat tighten, and he wondered for a moment if the jogger was going to make a run for it, if he was going to make some desperate escape attempt. But instead, the jogger spoke directly to George, his voice strained but clear. "You shouldn't be here. Get out of here. It's not worth it." Before George could respond, the sound of more sirens, louder this time, echoed from further down the street. This wasn't just a couple of patrol cars now. It was a whole fleet, and they were closing in fast. The suited man stiffened, and his eyes darted toward the distant noise, his jaw setting as if preparing for the inevitable. The jogger's body tensed as the men holding him began to move, tightening their hold, readying him for something George couldn't quite understand. The tension between them grew unbearable as the suited man nodded once more, as if giving the final order. Then, as the first few patrol cars skidded to a halt, the crowd of spectators, who had been quietly watching, erupted into a frenzy of confused shouting. Questions filled the air, but no one seemed to know who to ask or where to look. Panic rippled through the onlookers, and George felt a surge of adrenaline like never before. The suited man raised his hand, a single motion that instantly quieted the crowd. "Everyone stay where you are," he commanded, his voice carrying an authority that silenced the entire street. The officers around him stood rigid, unmoving, their eyes scanning the scene, ready for something George couldn't yet see. And then, as the sirens grew closer, the jogger spoke again, his voice louder now, with a fire in it that made George's skin prickle. "You think you can control this? You're playing with fire, and you have no idea who you're dealing with." The suited man's lips curled into a thin, cold smile, but there was no amusement in it. His voice was barely above a whisper as he replied, "You've already crossed a line. You just don't realize it yet." As the sirens blared even louder, the street seemed to shrink, the walls of tension closing in around George. His eyes darted from one person to the next, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding in front of him. And then, without warning, a sharp voice pierced the air. "Everyone step back. Now." A group of plainclothes officers emerged from the new wave of vehicles, their eyes scanning the crowd with an unsettling precision. They moved with purpose, cutting through the chaos, but their focus remained fixed on the suited man and the jogger. "Step back," the voice repeated, louder this time, a note of finality in it. The suited man held up a hand, signaling his team to hold their ground. The rising stakes were palpable now. Every move, every gesture, every breath seemed to carry the weight of a moment that could change everything. Something was about to break, something big, and George wasn't sure if he was ready to see it. The sirens grew louder, the shrill wail cutting through the thickening air as more officers poured onto the street. The suited man's hand twitched, and his gaze locked onto the jogger, who stood there, defiant despite the growing pressure. The tension was palpable, the air thick with uncertainty. George's heart thudded in his chest, and he found himself taking a half step forward, as if drawn into the storm that was about to unfold. The jogger's eyes never left the suited man, his body tense with the effort of restraining himself. His breathing came faster now, shallow, controlled. But his voice, when it finally came, was calm, too calm. "You don't get it, do you? You think you're the only one in control here?" His words echoed off the walls of the buildings lining the street, a challenge in his tone that made the suited man's jaw tighten. "I'm not some pawn in your game." The suited man's lips curled in an almost imperceptible smirk, the faintest glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He stepped closer, his hand brushing lightly against the concealed gun at his side. "You've already made your choice. The clock is ticking, and you're running out of time. Do you really think I care about your threats anymore?" The jogger's voice had an edge to it now, a fire that had been building behind the facade of calm. His chest heaved with the weight of it. "You don't scare me." George could feel the air shift, like the ground beneath him was tilting towards something terrible. There was something in the jogger's eyes, something so intense, so forceful, that it nearly pulled him in. Before George could process what was happening, a voice called out from the crowd behind them, sharp and clear. "Let him go." The voice came from a woman, her face flushed with anger and fear. She pushed her way through the crowd, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the suited man. "He hasn't done anything wrong. You don't have the right to." The suited man turned his head, his gaze searing through the woman with a silent threat. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. The tension between them was a force of its own, and for a moment, it seemed like the whole world had stopped, everyone holding their breath, waiting for someone to make the next move. The jogger, sensing the fragile moment, took a slow step forward. His voice dropped, lowering to a dangerous whisper. "I'm not running anymore. You've pushed me into a corner, and I'm done pretending I'm the one who should be afraid." A moment of utter stillness passed, and then the suited man's expression changed. It was subtle at first, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But then it shifted fully. The grip on his weapon loosened, and he took a step back. The jogger's words had struck deep, far deeper than George could have imagined. But before George could even begin to process the shift, a shout rang out from the far end of the street. "Stop! Get down on the ground!" The officers in plain clothes, the ones who had arrived last, were now flanking the suited man and his team. Their hands were on their weapons, but they hesitated, unsure whether to advance or pull back. The chaos had escalated, and now, it seemed like the entire street was on the edge of an explosion. Every eye was on the suited man and the jogger, the tension between them so thick that it felt like the air itself was ready to crack. "You're not getting away with this," the jogger spat, his body bracing as if for a blow. "Not this time." There was a brief, telling pause, an uncomfortable silence that stretched on for a heartbeat too long. The suited man's eyes flicked toward the backup officers, and George saw it. The smallest flicker of hesitation, the briefest moment where he seemed to doubt his next move. Then, in an instant, the suited man's hand moved to his radio. He barked a command that was nearly lost beneath the rising roar of the crowd. "Get them under control. Now!" Chaos erupted. The crowd surged forward, and the plainclothes officers began pushing people back with increasing force. In the distance, George saw movement. More cars, more figures emerging from the shadows. The streets were alive with tension, the sound of footsteps, shouting, and the hum of approaching sirens. The jogger's eyes locked onto George again, and for the first time, there was something different there, something almost pleading. He wasn't just trying to save himself anymore. He was trying to warn everyone. "You have to understand," the jogger said, his voice almost a growl, low and dangerous. "You're too close to this now. There's no way out unless you know the truth." The suited man stepped forward, his expression colder than ever. "You should have kept running when you had the chance," he said, his voice low and venomous. "Now it's too late." Suddenly, the sound of footsteps pounding on the pavement broke through the tension, growing louder, faster. George's heart raced. He turned instinctively, but before he could react, the jogger made a move that shocked everyone. He bolted. In a blur of motion, he was running, leaping forward with incredible speed. The suited man's shout echoed in the chaos, but the jogger was already gone, darting through the crowd with agility that was almost inhuman. George stood frozen for a moment, the world around him spinning. His eyes followed the jogger's figure, barely a blur now, but the suited man's voice snapped him back to reality. "Don't let him escape." The command was sharp, final, and with that, the streets erupted into chaos. The sound of sirens faded into the distance, replaced by the heavy breaths of those who remained in the street, caught in the aftermath of chaos. George stood frozen, the tension in his body still coiled tight, his mind struggling to make sense of the whirlwind he had just witnessed. The jogger was gone, lost in the crowd, but the image of him, sprinting away with the speed of someone far more than just a runner, lingered in George's mind. The suited man, his face contorted in anger, clenched his fists at his sides. His body was stiff, the mask of control slipping, revealing the cracks beneath. His eyes, now frantic, scanned the crowd, but the jogger was already a shadow in the distance, too far to reach. George took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could still hear the jogger's words echoing in his mind. Asterisk, "You think you're the only one in control here?" Asterisk, it was a reminder that control, when fought for, wasn't always so simple. It wasn't about who held the power in the moment, but about what happened when that power slipped. As the crowd began to disperse, some murmuring in disbelief, others in anger, George's heart slowed, the adrenaline pumping through his veins starting to ease. But a strange sense of clarity washed over him. He wasn't just a bystander anymore. He had seen something that couldn't be unseen. The suited man turned on his heel and walked briskly to his car, his footsteps heavy, filled with frustration. He didn't look back, and George knew that the confrontation, the rawness of what had just unfolded, would have consequences. The suited man was a player in a much larger game, and today's events would ripple outward, causing a shift. Perhaps it was the beginning of something bigger, a breaking point. George didn't move. His feet felt heavy, like the ground itself was resisting his next step. He had seen the cracks in the facade of power. He had felt the shifting dynamic. Things wouldn't be the same now. Not for him, not for anyone involved. The jogger, who had been just a face in a crowd moments ago, was now a symbol of something more. Something that couldn't be defined by a momentary act of defiance. It was something deeper, a confrontation of identity, of power, of perception. The jogger's words had struck a chord in George, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. The truth of that moment, power was never as clear-cut as it seemed. It could shift in an instant, and those who thought they were above it all could find themselves caught in its wake. And in that wake, George had seen it. The jogger was more than a figure running down the street. He was someone who had learned to take control of the narrative, to own his story, even when the world tried to erase him. George realized in that instant that he would never be the same. He would never look at power, or those who wielded it, the same way again. A few days later, the streets where it all began were quiet again. The news had spread, and the incident was dissected from every angle. People whispered about what had happened, about the jogger, about the man in the suit, but no one knew the full truth. No one except those who were there. George glanced at the streets one last time before walking away. His steps were more confident now, purposeful, as though the weight of his decision had finally been lifted. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that, in some way, the world had just shifted. Maybe it wasn't all for the better, but sometimes, change was the only thing that could create room for something real. The world outside was unpredictable, ever-changing. But George knew that now. He could face it with eyes wide open, with the truth in mind. As he walked down the street, the fading sunlight cast long shadows behind him, a reminder of everything he had just witnessed. He couldn't go back to the way things were. The world, much like him, would never be the same. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and follow for more gripping tales. Stay tuned for the next chapter in our journey of fictional stories.